myself. I am Andrew Deutz. I lead the global policy team for the Nature Conservancy. Our affiliate here in Canada is Nature United. Before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that COP15 is taking place on unceded indigenous lands. The Ghanaian Gihaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jojage, or Montreal as we now call it, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations because it's an island in the confluence of rivers, and now serves as a gathering place for the nations of the world to try and save and conserve the world's biodiversity. So I think a very fitting place for us. I'm going to invite up in a moment our first keynote speaker, Lord Zach Goldsmith from the UK, followed by Minister Orlando Habit from Belize, and then introduce a panel. Just to frame up the discussion, what we're talking about here today is how we green sovereign debt. We at the Nature Conservancy have done a handful of innovative debt for nature swaps, as they've been called in this context, debt conversions as we call them more generally. And we think it's a really interesting and innovative mechanism that can help solve both the nature crisis and the sovereign debt crisis and the climate crisis at once. And we want to talk today about how these deals work and how we scale them up. The conversation globally on this issue has accelerated profoundly in the last 6 months or so. Over the summer, the IMF put out a working paper on debt for climate swaps, thinking about how these mechanisms can be scaled up. And the IMF is probably the most important player in the world of sovereign debt. We have a speaker from the IMF today to talk about that paper and their thinking. For those of you who are in Sharm, Mia Mottley, who is the Prime Minister of Barbados and was our partner on one of these transactions, gave a barn burner of a speech in the opening plenary of the Sharm el-Sheikh COP, in part promoting the Bridgetown Initiative and thinking about how to reform the Bretton Woods institutions and the sovereign debt architecture to help developing countries deal with climate, debt, and nature crises. And one of the outcomes from the Egyptian COP was support from the Egyptian government for a number of countries, primarily Africa to start with, to establish a coalition on sustainable debt of countries looking at how to scale up these instruments. So today we want to talk about how these instruments work and how we can scale them up. So I'd like to invite the first speaker to give us some short introductory remarks, Lord Zach Goldsmith from the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to the fantastic Nature Conservancy for inviting us all along today. So if we're to become a nature-positive world, and clearly we have to for our survival, then we need finance, and we need finance from all sources. The pandemic and inflation, hugely exacerbated by Putin's war in Ukraine, are pushing debt now to unsustainable levels. The number of lower-income countries in debt distress, or at least in high risk of a debt distress, has doubled to 60% since 2015. So countries are spending more and more money today paying back loans as opposed to investing in people, investing in nature, investing in climate adaptation. Indebted countries are also nervous about asking for help because too often the conditions attached to that help are punitive, and also because of concerns over loss of market access or how private creditors might react. Now, there was a welcome surge in debt relief during the pandemic with the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the release of a special drawing rights, and we've got the G20 common framework to help countries deal with that debt. And that's all great, but it's not enough, it's not fast enough, and it's not for everybody. But despite all of that, debt-laden countries still face an uphill struggle. So we urgently need to reassess the architecture of debt and recognize the opportunity for nature to play a key role. We need the credit rating systems to look beyond minerals and timber and recognize natural assets and the wider roles of nature. And that shouldn't be difficult. We know, for example, that failure to protect watersheds has serious knock-on effects for the production of renewable energy. We know how mangroves and coral reefs insulate coastal communities and associated infrastructure against extreme weather events. We know intact peatlands store water during the dry seasons, slow down the flow of water in the rainy seasons, helping communities prevent droughts and floods. And we know forests all over the world generate much of the water that we need for food production. In short, nature, and we know this, is the source of almost everything we take for granted, and we may not yet have figured out precisely how to value nature in the modern context, but there is no mistaking the cost when we allow nature to be degraded. And the 1980s style debt for nature swaps were great at the time. They don't fit today as neatly into our increasingly complex financial structures, but we are seeing now the emergence of hugely promising new green sovereign debt instruments. For example, I think we're going to hear from the minister from Belize in a moment, but their recent announcement of the largest blue bond for ocean conservation to date, part of the Nature Conservancy's Blue Bond for Conservation program, which will enable that country to convert existing foreign currency bonds into blue debt that it'll then use to deliver its marine conservation agenda. We're seeing fascinating and innovative things emerging from Ecuador as well, which I think we're also going to hear about later. And the Inter-American Development Bank deal with Barbados, whose leader, as you said, Andrew, we heard a great deal from, and very forcefully at COP27 and indeed at COP26. The IDB deal with Barbados for a lower cost $100 million loan for marine conservation. Now the UK is also taking action to develop greener finance mechanisms. Through the Blue Planet Fund, which we set up about 2 years ago, the UK has been supporting the UN and the government of Fiji in developing the first sovereign blue bond for ocean health and coastal communities. And its launch, I think, was one of the highlights at COP27. Also at COP27, the UK government announced climate resilient debt clauses, and they offer a pause in repayments when a climate event like a hurricane or a drought hit a country. And we announced that the UK Export Credit Agency, which is called UK Export Finance, will begin incorporating climate resilient debt clauses in its sovereign lending to low-income and climate-vulnerable states as from next year, 2023. Now, Prime Minister Motley's Bridgetown agenda calls for a restructuring in global financial architecture in response to the triple crisis of debt, climate, and poverty. And the UK has been an early supporter of the need to restructure our global financial systems to adapt. And we stand ready to support the uptake of innovative green and climate-friendly sovereign debt instruments and to promote the importance of nature in driving development. And I would just finish by saying that when we talk about the finance gap that we know we face, some people put the figure at around $700 billion a year if we're to turn the tide on nature destruction. We know that's not all going to come from direct finance from governments. The world's total ODA, or aid contribution, not just climate and nature, but all aid, is around $160 billion a year. And if the gap is $700 billion, it's clear that even while donor countries need to step up and offer more finance for nature, for climate, that's not going to solve the problem. So we need to find other ways of accessing, releasing, and making that finance available beyond direct ODA. And that's what this event is about. And I really do salute the Nature Conservancy for their extraordinarily pioneering work in this area. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck for today.
Thank you so much for setting the stage for us, and for the work that the UK is doing now, particularly around incorporating climate resilience clauses into sovereign debt. Next, I'd like to call to the stage Orlando Herbert, the Minister for Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management from Belize. And sir, if I can invite you, since Belize has done probably the largest debt conversion for marine conservation, how does this deal work, and why did Belize feel this was a good thing to do to link sovereign debt and climate and nature outcomes? The floor is yours, sir.
Pleasant good morning. Certainly, listening to Lord Goldsmith, he has sort of characterized Belize in a certain way because he has explained how we have been affected not only through biodiversity loss, but also the issues of the impacts of climate change. Belize, going back November 2020, the new administration takes over, and we encounter a debt to GDP ratio of 133%, one of the highest in the region, possibly in the world. It was difficult for us to move with a new administration going forward, knowing the size of the economy, the population of the country, and certainly a tourism-based economy. And so we had to see what we could do in terms of restructuring our national debt, which was over $1 billion US. And so with the conversations with TNC, we believe that it was possible for us to restructure that debt, which through TNC and getting Bank Suisse and the political insurance from DFC from the US, we were able to restructure that debt to half the $1 billion debt by 500 million US dollars, Belize dollars, sorry. But not only that, but we were able to create an endowment fund of about 23.5 million US dollars, which would accumulate and grow and then be effective for use post 2041. In addition, we were able to structure in an amount of 8 million Belize dollars, $4 million US dollars, for a conservation fund that would be able to get into that fund on a yearly basis to sponsor conservation work, especially in the marine areas. We already have more than 39% of territory of the green areas in conservation, but we are also looking at how we can reach that 30% marine conservation. And so we were somewhere around 15%. So with this agreement, we moved over from 15 to 30% conservation. And while everybody's talking about 30% by 2030, I believe our commitment is to get there by 2026. So that's 4 years ahead of time. Important, though, is that whilst that marine space has traditionally been used by our fisher folk, these people will also, the fisher folk will also be engaged in livelihood, because they will be able to be the stewards of that area, doing all the monitoring and policing until we can see where that area that's producing enough fish and other life that they can use for their livelihoods in such a time that they do not have to get into those protected areas. But also important is that this project affords to support the coastal communities who live off these areas and off the produce and natural assets from the marine life. So I believe that going forward, it's not only looking at the marine space, but hopefully with TNC, we'll be looking even at the terrestrial side. We have just gotten reports that we have a report from a study done by the Pew Trust on our carbon assessment for mangroves. Hopefully next year we commence with assessments for seagrass. And in Belize, we have done our assessments through our Red Plus project. And so we are also looking to see how these benefits can also help us in the implementation of our NDCs. So all in all, I believe that for Belize, it is a win-win situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we talk a lot about win-win situations, but they're hard to find in practice. So thank you for coming and describing one and actually putting it into practice in Belize. The leadership that you've shown is phenomenal. Now I want to invite the panel up and talk about how do we take the example from Belize and Barbados and Seychelles and scale that up. So let me invite to the stage first Jennifer Morris, CEO of the Nature Conservancy, William Oman, who's an economist in the Monetary and Capital Markets Department of the International Monetary Fund, Juan Pablo Bonilla, who's the manager for climate change and sustainable development in the Inter-American Development Bank, which played a key role in the Barbados transaction, and Steve Liberatore, who's the managing director and head of ESG and impact in the Global Fixed Income Department of Nuveen, a major institutional investor. Thank you. All right, that one's on. Thank you. So let me start with you, Jen, first, if I can, and just invite you to explain a little bit more about how these deals work and what's the thinking on how we scale these up. I think it's a little bit funny, like, we're a nonprofit, And yet we've done 3 of these deals leveraging our balance sheet. And sitting in a conversation with our CFO the other day, he made the comment, the Nature Conservancy should start acting like an NGO and not a bank, right? So how do we get everyone else to be the banks, not us?
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And it's great to see everyone here. I want to first thank Minister Goldsmith, Lord Zach Goldsmith, who's no longer here, but thank him as well as the comments from you, Minister, from Belize. This is why we're doing this. It's because of countries like Belize and many of the other 70 countries that the Nature Conservancy is working in, and many of the partners in the room are working in. We have 3 crises on our hands, and many others, but the 3 that I'm going to focus on are, of course, nature, why we're all here, climate, and the debt crisis. And we can't expect countries like Belize and many others to continuously pay by themselves for the crisis that we in the North created. So that's why we're here, is to support countries like Belize to achieve not only their 30 by 30 goals, but also to reduce their debt and become more creditworthy in the future. So, you know, one of your comment about talking to our CFO is interesting. When I came to Nature Conservancy about 2.5 years ago, I came under the basically push to the board at the time that we would use our balance sheet, that we would be able to use the scale and scope of the Nature Conservancy to do these kind of innovative transactions. But of course, it has to be done in partnership. And I'll just say a few words. We've already talked a little bit about the portfolio that we've had so far, but we've done 3 deals. The first one in Seychelles was back in 2016. It took us a while to do Belize. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of it is once we always talk about this need for scale and for replication. And this is the situation where when I came in 2020, and said, why aren't we doing more of these deals? Like, well, Jen, it's hard, it takes time. You gotta take some risk. And that's one of the messages I just want to make sure we all hear today, is that we as an NGO need to take risk, and we're very fortunate that we have a balance sheet and a board that wants us to take risk. But we also need partners, and I know there's several financial institutions in the room, Credit Suisse, Bank of America. These banking institutions are, you know, sometimes a little bit slow to change. That one spark, that one person who can say to the CEO, we should do this, that can make all the difference. So no matter what institution that you're in, push your leadership to take this risk, because without the Credit Suisses and the Bank of Americas and the Inter-American Development Banks and the DFCs, who provided essential credit risk enhancements, we would never be able to do these transactions. But it was different, right? And it took that energy, that enthusiasm, that ability to say to the world, we don't have time to be conservative. We don't have time, as you know, Einstein always had said, to do the same thing over and over again and hoping for a new result. We had to change. And I think that's what's so compelling about this initiative. I will push back on one thing you said, Andrew. It's not going to solve the problem. It is a critical element in helping countries to finance their 30 by 30 goals and do some innovative things in risk insurance and resilience, coastal resilience. There was just a paper released about an hour ago that talks about the role of debt conversions in coastal resilience. This is about communities. This is about making sure these governments have a better debt situation. Now, I will say, this area of work is not without controversy. Some people say, well, don't convert the debt. They still have debt. Why don't you just forgive it? Well, I love that idea, but the reality is we have to do things that will move us forward and not just go for the Holy Grail. We can be pushing and saying debt forgiveness for all countries in the Global South, and I do think there are a lot of organizations doing that. The Nature Conservancy supports that effort. But in the meantime, until we can find that Holy Grail, we are doing these transactions that I think have incredible scale. Let me give you some numbers. So in the 3 deals we've done so far, Seychelles, Belize, and Barbados, we were able to restructure, refinance over $500 million in sovereign debt. That led to $230 million in new money for conservation. Money that would never have been there. Money that didn't have to come from public donors, didn't have to come from philanthropists who are very overstretched. This came through taking risks by Credit Suisse, by IDB, the DFC, coming together and doing a really interesting transaction. We have over $10 billion in pipeline, and that will lead to $2 billion in new money from conservation, again, from the private markets. And that's what I think is an element of this that's so interesting, is that, you know, I've had bankers now coming up to me after Sharm el-Sheikh and some of these talks that I've given on this topic saying, we want this. This is a fixed income product that's relatively low risk that hits every ESG box there is. Nature, climate, and helps debt distressed countries. We want in. So we have huge pipeline, and we think historically we've done, through those transactions, we've been able to protect over 500 million kilometers of marine, and slowly we're moving into the terrestrial space as well. So huge opportunity. I'll stop there just to say, take some risk. Don't be afraid. This takes radical collaboration and partnerships, and takes all of us working together to help countries like Belize make a difference in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. So next, let me turn to you, William. And first, I just want to take a minute and pause and say, this is the first time that the IMF has ever showed up at a CBD COP. So I want to acknowledge that and thank the IMF for showing up, because I think you're a critical part of the conversation. But seeing critical financial institutions like the IMF here as part of the constructive dialogue is something we really welcome. So thank you for coming. I want to ask you to reflect on the working paper that the IMF put out this summer, looking at all the macro issues that Jen spelled out around sovereign debt markets and what the role is of, the paper was on debt for climate swaps, we'll say transactions with climate or nature KPIs. What's the state of the art, and what's the best thinking in the IMF about how this mechanism can be scaled up?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's on. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. First, a disclaimer that the views I'll share are, as you said, are those of the working paper co-authored by my colleagues Marcos, Shimon, and co-authors. And so this is not official IMF policy at this stage. So just a quick disclaimer. So turning to the paper itself, I'd say a few things. First, the paper emphasizes that in general, and the consensus to date reflects that, it's more straightforward to tackle the debt and climate crises separately. However, it does also find that there are some circumstances where it makes sense to bundle the two together, in particular when neither debt restructuring nor adequate climate grants are on the table in specific countries. And so this is what the paper outlines. And in the current context, with many developing countries facing debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, so over half of DSSI countries in that situation, we do need a pragmatic approach. So there is room for swaps under the broader climate finance landscape in these circumstances. There are a lot of countries where a combination of grants and standard debt relief is not on the table. So this really highlights the importance of a pragmatic approach in climate finance and also nature finance. And here the paper stresses that a mechanism for creditors or donors to provide relief in return for a government commitment to invest in climate or nature action would be useful. So this really is the case for debt swaps. And the reason is that swaps would offer developing countries with little fiscal space the opportunity to undertake urgently needed climate or nature-related investments, especially those countries that wouldn't normally receive grants. And as echoing what was said earlier by other panelists, by the speakers, the recent debt for nature operations in Belize and also the Seychelles and Barbados show that these transactions are feasible. The big challenge we find in the paper is how to increase the number and the size of the debt swaps if donors are willing to provide more funding for these swaps. And we see three opportunities to increase the size of the pie. First, strengthen the market infrastructure by simplifying how creditors can monitor progress on the climate side. Moving to broad metrics like emissions or deforestation would allow more projects to be considered and would reduce the need for expensive evaluation. Second, step up the number of transactions by moving from one-off projects to multiple projects bundled together. Here, creditors could support a range of activities grouped together by type of activity. For example, investment in resilience or decommissioning fossil fuel power plants. Where countries have strong public financial management, programmatic approach could have a big impact because resources for climate spending could be channeled directly into national budgets. And the South Africa JETP reflects this approach. And third, structure swaps to maximize fiscal space available for climate and nature investment by bringing the biggest amount of debt to the table in these operations. How to do this? By buying up debt from other creditors on the secondary market. And even better is doing that at a discount. And in so doing, get more climate or nature bang for each donor buck, so to speak. And finally, turning to the latter part of your question on how the IMF intends to put these ideas into practice. So the IMF, as I mentioned, doesn't yet have an official view on this issue. So this is a working paper, so it reflects staff view. And the paper highlights sort of the pros and cons of these swaps. But the fund does recognize that this is another tool in the climate finance toolkit. It's not for the fund to operationalize it, it's for countries to operationalize it. And so the instrument is not part of the fund's operational framework at the moment. But the fund will support swaps under the circumstances that I described.
All right, thank you. I mean, I still think that's an important set of recommendations there on how we scale this up. And just, coming from an institution that probably thinks more about these issues than any other, that's really helpful. Let me turn now to Juan Pablo, right, and get a little bit operational, because the IDB provided a guarantee that helped support the Barbados transaction. And I know you've got your eyes on some other opportunities in the region. And as one of the most forward-thinking banks in this space, where do you see the opportunity? How does this work, and how do we scale it? Because I think the biggest opportunity we're looking for is how do we scale up the use of the guarantee instruments which you're pioneering?
Thank you. Are you listening? Okay. First of all, Jennifer, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure being with you today, and thanking TNC for the partnership that we've done, not only for Barbados, but for other activities that we're starting to do. I'll talk about Para at the end. It's not a big guarantee, but it's going to be something very innovative. Jennifer, you were mentioning that we need to push and take more risk. And there are many lessons learned that we have at the IDB that are helping us to understand how to move forward. And you're going back to your question. First, we were the first MDB that developed a natural capital and biodiversity lab for financing innovation with the support from the UK and France. But then 2.5 years ago, we merged that group with the climate division. So we're the first MDB that is putting together climate and biodiversity to think as a joint solution for all the challenges that we have. And that hasn't been easy, Jennifer. But I'm starting to see the results of the two groups working together and thinking about the link of climate and biodiversity. Second, we needed to start working internally at the bank with the group that is in charge of the financial mechanisms and also with the Treasury Department of the bank. Why am I mentioning this? Because when you go to the countries of Latin America, that's why I want to congratulate Minister Belize, you need to start also putting these links together, climate and biodiversity. Then the teams of the Ministers of Finance and Planning with the Ministries of Environment, and have a different way to start seeing this as an opportunity, considering all the impacts that we're seeing on climate and biodiversity. The third part, Andrew, is we need to invest a lot in capacity building at the country level. The case of Barbados, we started working with the governor of Barbados a couple of years ago in the Roof to Reef program, that is the key program of the Prime Minister, and then supporting the Roof to Reef unit, the NDC, the Action Plan of Biodiversity. And before we get this deal, we had the contingency line for natural disasters to Barbados. This is a very innovative instrument that the bank has. We have already 17 countries of the region with these contingency lines for about $4 billion. They are lines for the ministers of finance to respond to disasters, but they are not part of the envelope that we discussed with the Minister of Finance, and they don't pay any interest until they need to use the contingency line. Why am I mentioning the contingency line? Because we went further a year ago after COP26, and with the Treasury Department of the bank, we developed the hurricane clause. That is a clause that allows to postpone the payment of principal for 2 years in countries subject to natural disasters. But you need to have the contingency line to be able to have the hurricane clause in any lending that the IDB does to those countries. So, when we start working with the TNC for this instrument, it's a policy-based guarantee. It's a new product of the bank that, based on some policy changes, we provide a guarantee. And as Jennifer said, given the AAA of the IDB, that helps a lot the pricing to free in some space to be used in conservation or any other sustainability activity. So the deal in Barbados was 150, 100 from us, 50 from TNC, and it's freeing $50 million to the new fund for environment and sustainability in Barbados. And the good thing is that policy-based guarantee of the ADB has included the hurricane clause because they already had the contingency line. So it's just to show you that it's beyond the instrument. It's how, as a system, as Jennifer mentioned, we start putting together different components to develop resiliency. And we're giving a technical cooperation of $600,000 to the governor of Barbados, also to support not only the fund, but everything that we'll consider for the implementation in the future with TNC and with the University of West Indies. Now, I mentioned a lot the ministers of finance, and we have developed in the last year and a half a new platform for ministers of finance of the region. We just got $30 million from the government of Germany to support more than 20 countries of the region. Minister, we hope to engage very soon with you, to strengthening the capacities at the ministries of finance for climate, biodiversity, and sustainability in general. So this will be a key priority of the bank in the next 5 years. Now, Jennifer, pushing more the needle. I'm speaking about the IDB public side. The IDB group, we have BidInvest, which is our private sector side, and BidLab, which is our lab of innovation. BidInvest is already part of TCFD, and they support already private sector banks in Latin America. Davivienda in Colombia was the first one to be part of TCFD. And BidInvest announced at COP26 the first blue bond in the region that was with their own balance sheet. But now, this week, they closed the first blue bond in the region with a private sector bank, with Banco Bolivariano in Ecuador. It's a 60 million blue bond, 40 BidInvest, 20 with FinDev Canada. And the good thing, Jennifer, is one of the KPIs of the blue bond with Banco Bolivariano is to disclose their alignment with TNFD. I think it's the first bank in Latin America that is going to disclose that. So I wanted to highlight also the role of the private sector of the IDB group that is starting a new process that is called BidInvest 2.0, very aligned to what was discussed at the COP27. It's a different model to originate to share. It's de-risking a mobilization, but to do that, we need more money. You have Nick Stern pushing a lot, saying, listen, we're asking a lot to the MDBs, but we need more capital to the MDBs to do this. So I think having capital increases with the opportunity to link nature, biodiversity, and everything that we're discussing is a huge opportunity for the MDBs. BidInvest is starting that process that hopefully will go forward soon. Last, I mentioned Pará, and I want to thank Jennifer and TNC again, because I was yesterday in a meeting and they asked about communities, how to get to communities in a faster way. We're going to start with TNC, a payment for results that is part of our new Amazon initiative in Pará. It's $2.5 million, and we hope to do something similar in Colombia soon. But I'm working already with the social department of the bank. Our banks has worked a lot in non-conditional and conditional transfers in the issue of health and education. And they have developed amazing safety nets to do that. I think it's the time to bring, as part of the just transition, our social departments to start thinking about non-conditional and conditional transfers linked to conservation, linked to develop resiliency. But we need the rating agencies to change also the way they are seeing this. Jennifer, I was yesterday with S&P, and S&P in the rating, for them is the same when we provide a guarantee that a loan. So for Barbados, the policy-based guarantee of 100 million in our accounting from the rating agencies counts exactly the same that a loan. So Minister, when we develop the envelope with you, it's exactly the same for you to ask for a loan with the IDB that to a guarantee. So are we going to continue measuring guarantees linked to resilience in the future equally than loans? That's a key issue that we need to reform the system. And I said at the COP27, we need to stop penalizing vulnerability. We need to start rewarding resiliency. If we develop resilience in a country, how the Standard & Poor's, the rating agencies are going to consider that in the rating of the country. Are the insurance companies also recognize if we, MDBs and others, are helping countries to create resiliency at lower premium? I'm glad to see the IMF. Barbados, I read, get an agreement to access the SDRs under the new facility that you have. That's great news. I think Costa Rica is behind. But the question is in Article 4, how you're going to review in the programs also resilience. Are you going to count resiliency as a public debt equally? We need to create more space in the countries to invest. So anyways, this is a fascinating conversation. This is something that I talked to Jennifer a long time ago. But we're starting to see a call for the MDBs, for the financial system to think different. So thank you for the opportunity. For us, it's an honor and a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. There's a lot to unpack there. We could use another hour, but we're going to keep moving. I appreciate. I want to reflect in particular on the role that IDB played in the credit enhancement. So the sort of hypothesis here is that the missing ingredient for us to go to scale is the ability of the public institutions to provide more and better credit enhancement, to help developing countries or debtor countries that don't have market access or are close to market access upgrade their credit rating and therefore be able to crowd in private investors. So that's going to leave me to Steve, right? You're the money in the room. In the context of the CBD, we're talking about how do we close a $700 billion a year financing gap. Current ODA level for biodiversity is about $10 billion. Everyone acknowledges we need to figure out how to leverage the private sector, and the question is how do we do that? Well, you think this is one of those instruments, right? So the question to you quite simply is, what is it going to take for the money that's out there in the ESG world, in the emerging markets world, to come in to support these kinds of transactions? What are you looking for? So what do people who are working on the structuring and people like Juan Carlos who can provide some of the credit, what do we need to design so that the money that you manage on behalf of your beneficiaries can come into the space and we can take this to scale?
First off, thank you for having me, and I feel bad having to follow on Pablo. I think that there's really, where we are right now in the marketplace is the concept of impact investing, which is what we're really talking about here in the public market, is really still somewhat of a new concept, right? We at Nuveen have been doing it for over 10 years, but we're one of the first real hard participants in this particular space. So we're willing to look at new, unique, different types of transactions. And everything we've ever done, we've always tried to get to a place where we can scale and have template-like transactions. But for the market in general, what has been shown over time is that outside of a handful of institutional investors, there has been a reticence to have other institutional investors participate in deals regardless of what they look like. And I think the 3 TNC deals are a good example of, the Seychelles followed by the Belize, followed by the Barbados transaction, show kind of the evolution of getting to a place where the market can be understanding of what the transaction is. Every participant is partaking in their role in the manner in which the market views them. So you're looking at a organization like an MDB or a Nature Conservancy and providing guarantees at a level that indicate their involvement and understanding of the transaction. One of the things that's really often lost, I talk a lot about this a lot, is people ask, well, why don't we do more of these deals? Why aren't they faster? And the real challenge in it is that there is a lot of complexity here. I'm a fixed income expert. I've also been managing ESG and impact and public fix for 20 years. But I'm not an environmental scientist. So I need to have access to experts like at the TNC, like IADB, who can help walk me through and walk my team through what exactly is going on. What exactly is the intentionality? Is there additionality? How will this benefit our investors, not from just a return perspective, but are we meeting their goals from an impact perspective? So what we have seen, and again, the 3 TNC deals are a perfect example for us, is we did not participate in the Seychelles debt restructuring. We did lead the Seychelles World Bank Blue Bond. We did not participate in the Belize deal. Apologies, Minister. But we are the owner of the TNC tranche of the Barbados deal and the majority of the IADB deal. That has come from work that we have done with TNC, IADB, with CS, Credit Suisse on the transaction, and I think it reflects the path on which we're on, where the investor has to be brought in early. They have to be able to participate in the discussion and at least be able to understand what's going on, so that, you know, even as much experience and expertise as we have with $20 billion of assets and $8 billion of impact investments, we still need time talking to the experts at a TNC or an IADB to get comfortable with the structure of the transaction. And also what we saw was that those two organizations played the role that the market perceives them as playing within the market. So that, I think, is key, and that, I think, helps alleviate some concerns from investors. And I think we're now getting to a place where these transactions look more template-like. So I think will be more amenable and more accessible for other institutional investors. At least we hope so.
Can I just push on the point of thank you, the credit enhancement requirements? Like, there are a couple of countries out there now that are able to issue sovereign debt directly into the market and link it to climate KPIs. Uruguay and Chile have done that. There's a much larger tranche of countries that are on the verge of market access and need a little help from their friends, right? So that's where the credit enhancement piece comes in, and Juan Pablo's talked about how we need to scale that up. What are the criteria that you look at as an investor for these kinds of deals to know this is what it's going to take from the public credit enhancement piece to be able to really make this attractive to the private sector and come in? Like, what are the conditions and criteria you're looking for? What do we need to be designing for?
So I'll start off with my general comments that we on the impact side are a use of proceeds investor, so we do not invest in sustainability-linked securities. So we've had multiple conversations with Chile and with Uruguay. We were very disappointed that they chose to issue sustainability-linked bonds. Especially in case of Chile, they had historically been a use of proceeds investor, so we had participated in numerous of their transactions. Uruguay, disappointed there because they have a long history of commitment to the environment and have a lot of very interesting programs and policies and investment projects in place that we would have loved to have had direct exposure to. So I think, again, for us as an investor, what we're looking for is there a direct and measurable outcome associated with the capital that we're providing? And what we want to see is, you know, everything that I'm managing is on an active total return basis. So the first thing that I have to deliver to my investors is attractive long-term total performance. However, the second most important thing that we deliver is direct and measurable outcome. And we need to deliver that impact in a way that our investors are looking for it, and we know we're providing additionality as well as intentionality within the transaction. So I think that the real key for us is seeing transactions that are set up where there's an obvious intentionality in the outcome of the proceeds being utilized. It's not a situation where maybe you're backing into a transaction and saying, well, the real purpose is X, but maybe we can throw the word sustainability or blue or green on it and kind of make it appear that's really what we're doing, but it's not really the intention of what the transaction is. And additionality is also important, making sure that what we're providing capital for is generating outcome or impact that wasn't already really going to occur anyways. Unless it's a refinancing, that's a different discussion. But I think for us, it's clear and concise, use of proceeds, intentionality, and having the market participants participate again in the role that the market views them as partaking within the market itself.
All right, thank you. So we got some marching orders there. So I want to turn back to Jen and Juan Pablo for a minute to think about where do we go with this agenda. And I'm particularly focused on, you know, in responding to Mio Motley and the Bridgetown Initiative, President Macron wants to host a summit on reforming the Bretton Woods architecture. There's probably other words than reforming we can be used, but think about how do we adapt them now to be fit for purpose in a climate changing world to deal with the nature crisis and to deal with sovereign debt. So I want to hypothesize that a significant portion is, as you say, we need a bigger balance sheet and we need sort of fit for purpose guarantee instruments to scale this up. What do you see as the next most impactful steps that we as the community of, to the deal makers trying to make this work, and to the governments, some of whom are in the room, who are on the shareholders of those institutions, including your own, like, where do you see the next most important steps to be able to scale this up? How does this dialogue go forward?
Thank you. It's a very good question, and that's why I mentioned the importance of capital increases of the MDBs. I think we are leading many issues by example, but the last capital increase of the ADB was in 2009. So I'm saying this wherever I go. With more capital, we will be able to do part of the transformation that you mentioned. The last meeting that we had with different ministers of the region, the way to really move the needle for the future from the public side is to build with the ministers of finance investment plans, links to NDCs, links to the biodiversity plans, and then see different mechanisms. You can have lending from us, instrument like this, issuing bonds linked to those investment plans, but they will send a long-term signal. You cannot change NDCs or investment plan every 4 years. And the only ministers that can do this are the ministers of finance. So if we have more capital linked to investment plans of NDCs and national biodiversity plans, and second, we invest, as you mentioned, a lot of technical cooperation to develop the KPIs to measure that. And I'm glad you mentioned Uruguay, because the latest that the Minister of Finance announced at the COP, we invested, Isabel here is with me, she worked a lot in the deal, about $1 million in technical cooperation to strengthening the capacity in Uruguay to the 2 or 3 KPIs that are part of the bond. And it's the first one that it will have stepped down and up linked to the NDC. So why I mention this? Because from the public side, I think that's the way to go. Linking capital increases to this, and second, paying for results. If we develop facilities internally with more capital, that as part of the lending throughout the 20, 25 years of a loan that we do, you measure every 4 years, results. Links to climate, to biodiversity, decrease every 4 or 5 years the cost of the lending. So I think that should be part of the discussion for the future. Private sector, you are totally right. When we listen to trillions, the question is how many investors are willing to go not to Chile or to Uruguay, to countries that you said that are way more difficult to go, and if they are willing to do local currency, that is a key issue. So that's where the model that BidInvest is starting to develop, to do more guarantees, to de-risk, to mobilize, is the way to go. But again, we need more capital to do it. So it's easy to ask for more money, but if you say, listen, the purpose of more money would be this one, I think is the way to go.
Thanks. I mean, I'm hoping that we can do the math that shows the ask for more money around guarantees and the capital increase of the banks to actually tell the story of how that's going to leverage private finance. When you look at the stack of capital in the climate finance discussions right now it's something like $4 of public capital is leveraging $1 private capital. We need to figure out how to reverse that. Right, that's the real challenge. So, Jen?
Yeah, sure. Let me pick up on the last point. So, look, I think the key on the private sector side is we have to have these more guarantees. So more money for these institutions is critical. I also think we need to make the transactions boring. We need to make them regularized so that bankers who are doing this can say, oh yeah, I know this product, no problem. Instead of like, what is this, right? And so we've got 3 under our belt. The more we do these, the more they will become normalized. The more we will have standardized tracking for what is this actually doing from an impact perspective. And we'll be able to easily explain it to investors so that that's when you have scale. Unfortunately, when it becomes kind of boring and regular, that's when you get scale. You take risk in the beginning, you prove it can work, and then you roll it out big time. Now, to your specific question, which is a very important one, which is being talked about a lot, thanks to Mia Motley's leadership in pushing a reform, a new sort of Bretton Woods for these institutions. these institutions play a critical role in the global economy. They're absolutely essential. There's been a lot of talk about scrapping them or creating new funds, and I will just say that, you know, I don't think that will get us to where we need to go. We need some reform. We need to have, I loved your quote, rewarding resiliency and stopping to analyze vulnerability. Like, we need those credit enhancements, those specific metrics where we can actually reward countries, where we can give countries a break when they do have a hurricane, such as the product that was announced and was mentioned around hurricane pausing and repayments. Those are just going to be so important. And the reality is, if we don't do this now, all of the countries of the global north are going to be paying a lot more later. So let's figure it out. We don't need to throw these institutions out, but we do need some reform, and we have to do it quickly, because countries are hurting now, and the cycle is just going to continue and get worse as we go forward.
Thanks. We have a couple minutes left before we need to break. I'm going to throw to the audience. Is there any key questions out in the audience that you want to put to the panel? There's a lot of expertise up here. Yes, in the back.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the excellent contributions. In the context of very small islands, as in the Eastern Caribbean where I'm from, we speak about scaling up, but at our scale, how does this really work? Can it really work?
So Jen, do you maybe want to walk through what one of these transactions looks like?
So you're sitting behind one of the world's experts in this space, and two of the world's experts, Slav and Kevin Bender. So you guys raise your hands. They're going to really hate me for that later. So they're complicated. The first is a commitment to achieving a 30 by 30 target, and a plan the government would have around how to achieve that. So that's the first thing that we look for. And we also have our ocean conservation expert in the room from the Nature Conservancy, Melissa Garvey. You want to raise your hand? She can also help you think through, like, what are the things that we would look for to even start the conversation. Second, of course, is your debt, right? If we're going to do a debt transaction, you have to have eligible debt. You have to have debt that's trading at the right amount so that we can get the spreads we need for the conservation investment. So it depends on your situation, but if there are other countries that are interested, small island states, absolutely, there's opportunity there. But to some of the points that were made earlier, we need to be scaling this. I think the IMF paper says this. You know, we need to be bundling these things so that we can aggregate and get something. Bigger transactions take often as long as smaller transactions. So we need to go big and figure out how to do that in your context.
All right, thanks. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. I'm from the insurance world. I think I've heard the word insurers once, and I think your comment on stopping penalizing vulnerability and starting rewarding resilience hold for insurance as well. But how do you see the insurance role in terms of providing capital? Because I think there's a lot of private capital that stands in the Indian industry as well, depending on the geographies. But I think there's a lot there.
Thanks. I don't know, Juan Pablo, if you want to take that, because there's
Sure.
insurance companies as potential investors, but there's also insurance companies that actually been backstopping these deals.
I think we should have a kind of a resiliency agreements, to call it somehow, in which if, for example, an island state starts investing with our support in A, B, and C, they have an agreement with insurance companies to reduce the premium. It's like insurance works in everything. It's how you align the incentives to reduce the premium. We're not there yet, and we need a frank conversation about that. But measuring is going backwards with the insurance company saying, listen, if you invest in these 4 issues, you change the building codes, you do coastal management, some could be engineering works, some could be nature-based solutions, then from year A, B, or C, we will review the premium, and let's have a monitoring scheme to do that. I'm just throwing this as a brainstorming. I don't have an answer, but I think it's part of the conversation that we need to do. The other issue is how to do blended finance, that I didn't mention this at the beginning, from MDBs. We've used a lot of blended finance also to work with first losses, for example, with insurance companies, more to decarbonization. We need to start doing that for resiliency also in the future. And now that we're in Canada, BitInvest is a good example. They had a fund with Canada called the C2F, the Carbon 2 Fund, has been the key blended fund of BitInvest to develop more renewables. They are in the process of developing a new fund with Canada for the first time, Jennifer, to include resiliency and nature.
All right, thank you. I'm afraid we're at time. So first I want to thank the panel. This has been a fabulous conversation. And just say, I'm sort of like, one of the things I'm optimistic about is the speed at which this agenda has caught on. As we started thinking about what we should be doing, the world has moved faster than we've been thinking. And I have a feeling that in the next couple of months, the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of attention on how we reconcile the triple crises around sovereign debt, climate, and nature, and how we start coming up with some interesting financial innovations to link those issues in ways that can improve the financial outcomes and financial sustainability in the balance sheets of debtor countries, and also accelerate the ability to implement our climate and conservation commitments. So hopefully this is going to be, as Jen said, a part of the solution, not the solution, but a part of the solution going forward. So again, thank you to my panelists, and thank you for coming today.